Welcome to the first episode, Skills Upgrade, a Talking Drupal mini-series following the journey of a Drupal 7 developer learning Drupal 10. I'm Amy June Heinlein. I'll be your host for the series. I am a Drupal mentor coordinator, and I work at the Linux Foundation as their certification community architect. I'm really responsible for supporting the certifications team's efforts in building and maintaining exams related to documentation for exam products for the Linux Foundation's certification portfolio. During this mini-series, we'll follow a Drupal 7 developer as he upgrades his skills to work on Drupal 10 projects, with the ultimate goal of supporting Drupal 10 project and contribution to the community. This will be a weekly show. Each week, a mentor will review the developer's progress, answer questions, and set goals for the upcoming week. So let's talk about our developer and mentor. Our developer is Chad Hester. He's Chad Hester on D.O. He's an enterprise technical consultant and solutions architect with a background in website development for over 20 years. His passions include information architecture, human-centered design, agile development, growth-driven design, and selling open source software solutions. He's an active participant in the Drupal community. I work with him on several projects. He is also in the UX community. In his free time, he travels with his wife, explores nature, enjoys photography, and trains his dog. Mike Anello is our mentor. He's Ultimike on Drupal.org. He is the co-founder and president of Drupal Easy, a Drupal training and consulting firm based in Central Florida. Mike has been one of the main organizers of Florida Drupal Users Group and Florida Drupal Camp for over 15 years. He's a member of the Drupal Community Working Group. He has helped manage the Drupal Association's Community Cultivation Grants Program. Mike has been developing Drupal sites for over 15 years, and he specializes in module development, theming, data migration, and general site building with a really strong focus on educating people on best practices in sustainable development. He is also the lead trainer and curriculum developer for Drupal Easy's intensive 12-week Drupal Career Online and the 15-week professional module development courses. So today, as we start the series, Chad and Mike will meet for the first time. They'll talk about Chad's background, experience, and goals, and Mike will set some modest goals for Chad's first week.
Hey, Chad. So this is the first time we've met online. No, actually, it's not you reminded me that we did meet at a DrupalCon, which I'm sorry I don't recall, but you said it was very quick, so I'm going to take that as my excuse. But nice to see you again, I guess.
Yeah, likewise.
So tell me a little bit about your web development background and your Drupal background.
Sure. So it goes pretty far back. I started off my education originally thinking that I was going to become a mechanical engineer, and that exposed me to computers, things like that. Then I started with desktop programming, Visual Basic 6, C++, Java. Did that professionally for a little while in the early 2000s. And then I started getting into the web because it was still budding and a much easier way to deal with distributing information than the software that you'd have to install. So I started off with ASP. And when .NET came around, I had already been working with Linux for a while. I had already kind of cut my teeth on PHP, already knew, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as it was kind of coming into its own. And I had that choice of, do I want to shift over? And the open source community really drew me in. At that time, I wasn't sure what I was going to use. So I looked at Joomla, I looked at Drupal, I looked at WordPress, and I even looked at MediaWiki as platforms to use to build in PHP. And I landed on Drupal just because, it felt less clunky than Joomla. It felt a bit more robust than WordPress. And the community was really strong. There were multiple podcasts that I could listen to when I was commuting. There were lots of books. Lullabot had lots of DVD tutorials back then. And I started really around the cusp of Drupal 5, Drupal 6, kind of backpedaled into 4.7 for maintenance of sites as a professional developer. And when 7 came out, I was really comfortable and mature with, get flow for deployments and local development and things of that nature. So that's the kind of quick version of it. But yeah, I got pretty comfortable, but got into more management, strategy, leadership, design roles, and kind of stepped a little bit away from development around 2016.
So what's really odd about this is you and I have extremely similar backgrounds. I have a degree in mechanical engineering as well. I started out doing mechanical engineering on the simulation side of things, so a lot of software, a lot of computer stuff. I think I'm a few years older than you, so I started doing some web stuff in the mid to late 90s, right as Mosaic was, the first browser was out there. I was starting to play with it. I had free time at work, to be quite honest, and I just started playing with it. And, like you, I kind of ventured out and, looked at ASP, and you didn't mention Cold Fusion. I did Cold Fusion for a while. That was kind of scary.
I dodged that one, but I did ActionScript in Flash.
Okay, there you go. So let's talk about your Drupal 7 experience a little bit. And it was, I kind of smiled when you said like the Git workflow and stuff. Did you miss like the whole CVS workflow, or did you have the joy of using the CVS
I worked very briefly with CVS. I remember the transition. I also worked with Subversion a little bit too. So there was that whole big transition that happened. I remember that.
Oh yeah. And people thought like the Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 transition was hard. That transition from SVN to Git, that was something as well. So tell me a little bit more about Drupal 7 experience. You said you're comfortable with it. I think you said that you had done some development. So let's talk about, since I think we're going to be focused mainly on Drupal 10 development in the next, not few episodes, but all the episodes. So tell me about like your Drupal 7 experience with development, either on the module development side or the theme development side or whatever.
Yeah, I because of that engineering background, my mind is a bit more towards the mechanics of things. So I'm a bit more of a back-end developer. I kind of grew up in the table layout, growing into the tableless layout, that transition in CSS. And I was never really fond of floats in CSS. And I kind of cut off from there. I do have an aesthetic and a design background, but I'm not a fan of front-end development in general. I'm okay with it, but I'm more of a back-end developer. So my experience with Drupal development really started getting strong with things like UberCart and Drupal 6, then Drupal Commerce. Love the platform. Really liked making those types of sites. And in general, just finding ways to manipulate the information architecture, that part of tooling I really like as well. So that marriage between the backend systems, whether it's through integrations or migrating, I've done a few migrations as well. I'm really eager to see how that's grown in newer versions of Drupal, because now is prime time getting everyone ready for that Drupal 7 upgrade with the end of life. But yeah, I think my Drupal 7 development days were probably the core of my experience. And
did you contribute core contributor modules or anything like that?
I had a couple of small contrib modules. One probably wasn't exactly ideal. I think it was like turning a block into an entity that I could use with an entity reference field. Not exactly the ideal way to use a block, but I just wanted to scratch a specific itch. And I think there were a couple of others. There were patches and things like that. And I think it's changed a little bit since then.
So you have comfort with like PHP though. I guess that's kind of one thing I was trying to tease out of you a little bit. How about, you mentioned, some other languages that you use. How about object-oriented languages? Are you comfortable with, classes and subclassing and interfaces and overriding methods and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, just like it's been since 2016 doing programming. I mean, Drupal 7 had some minor object-oriented with the Migrate API back in the day, but it wasn't really prevalent. And prior to that, between C++ and Java, which is admittedly a good bit different than PHP in many respects.
Right, but the theory conceptually, object orientation is object orientation for the most part.
Yeah.
Hand reading a lot here, but you know what I'm saying.
And I do recall the difference between things like polymorphism versus inheritance and those concepts from computer science. but it's been a while.
So,
I've gotten older, and I think it's time to kind of dust those things off and understand what that means in the Drupal dev world.
so did you? So what happened? Or I don't say what happened. That sounds like something awful happened. But you stopped doing Drupal 7 development. You said like 2016, I think, and now it's 2024. So that's 8 years according to my math. So did you leave Drupal? Were you working as a barista for the last 8 years, or like what have you been doing for the past 8 years where you weren't doing Drupal? Are you still in IT? Are you still like talking about Drupal in any sense, or like what have you been doing?
Sure. So I've been still in the Drupal community. I've been working mostly with digital agencies, done some freelance contracting as well. So, for example, I have a client right now that needed help with her SEO for her travel agency, something like that. But it came to a point around 2015, 2016 where leading up to that, I started to, I think people start to become managers or leaders or tech leads or whatnot. For me, I also got heavily into user experience design. So user experience research, information architecture. I have the biggest passion for IA. And I started doing much more in terms of sales engineering, solutions architecture, business analysis. So that's what I've been doing professionally for really the past 8 years plus. Again, for digital agencies that mostly focus on Drupal. Because I've worn a lot of hats, it allows me to talk to pretty much everyone on the team and client stakeholders, that sort of thing,
Right.
and be able to shift my language to suit people. But I think with wearing so many hats and shifting over, I knew that when I was 70, I didn't want to necessarily be staring at a screen with tiny type and whatnot. So I knew that at some point I might want to shift my focus.
But
And
you can use Command Plus on your keyboard. That'll make it larger. That's what I do. Not quite 70 yet. Holy cow!
getting up there. No, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be doing development long term, and I
Right.
appreciated the management and design and sales side of things quite a bit. So I spent a good bit of time doing that.
So it's not like you haven't been in the Drupal ecosystem. You can still talk the talk. I'm gonna guess that your site building skills are probably still strong,
Yep,
and you can
that
talk to
axe.
developers. Let's say that
Yeah, I've
again. I'm
been
sorry.
using the axe is sharp. I've been using things like Layout Builder and a lot of the newer tools for a lot of things. And if I had to really get into module development on my own, I could fiddle my way through it. But that's not the same thing as being a professional developer again. So
Sure.
I want to kind of delineate between those two. But if I had to
And
stand
that's
up a
the
Drupal
goal,
site,
right? Let's cut right to the chase here. That your goal
yeah,
is to be the skills to gather the skills necessary to be a professional Drupal module developer in
yeah,
Drupal 10 and 11 and beyond. Is that accurate?
yeah. I actually set out 5 specific goals for this effort. I
Mhm.
Because I do a lot of training.
Mhm.
I wrote my own curriculum document just so I can kind of keep things um, honest and capture those things. But more importantly, I'm neurodivergent. So for me, I get very overwhelmed if I don't have a plan. So that's my accommodation for myself. So the goals that I came up with are number one, finding freelance contracting opportunities or employment to apply what I've learned for Drupal 10 specific to development. And then number two is to understand the difference between Drupal 10 and Drupal 7 development. It's grown quite a bit. Number three is to help organizations build Drupal 10 websites and migrate from Drupal 7. With the end of life coming up, I think right now is a really good opportunity. Number four is to utilize Drupal 10 development knowledge to help in an advisory capacity when planning new websites and improving existing ones. So really just dusting that off and being a bit more competent in that area. And the last one is to share my learning experience with the Drupal community, especially to help developers who stopped with Drupal 7, like me. Maybe they went to Backdrop or something other, and to help them catch up, if you will, similar to what I'm doing.
Right. Okay. And you also have, and I'm looking at the same document. You also have, well, here, let me back up a second. So those are like the end goals of where you would like to be in 6 months, 9 months, a year from now, something like that. I don't, whatever your timeline is, I'm not sure.
My
You
hope
also
is,
have a list of objectives, which
yeah,
really, for me, those break down the really, I would say almost just focusing on your second goal of understanding the difference between Drupal 10 and Drupal 7 development.
yeah,
Your objectives they're all, I think, technical, where a
yeah.
lot of your other goals you just read are more, they're going to be a result of you being more comfortable with Drupal 10 development. Is that a safe way of characterizing that?
That's exactly right. So one is like strategy versus tactical sort of thing.
Right. Yes, exactly. All right, cool. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So I'm looking, we're about 13 minutes in so far. We want to keep these between 15 and 30 minutes. So I want to be aware of the time there. So just a few more questions. I just want to, again, this is the first time that we've talked about this. We decided we weren't going to have a conversation before we recorded because that conversation should be recorded. So let's kind of go through a few things here. What's your operating system of choice?
I like Mac mostly
Okay.
because I found it more stable than Windows, and
Right.
Linux. Well, I love it, but wow, there's so much upkeep if you're really going to try to use it to its
Sure.
full capacity.
Right. I'm going to guess that you're comfortable on the command line because we've talked about,
Yep.
we've talked about it.
Every single one.
All of the command lines. Okay.
All the command
Um,
lines.
do you use like a modern local development environment at this point? Or have you had a chance to like stand up a Drupal site on your Mac in the past few years?
Under guidance, because I've helped a few people either with quality assurance testing, so local environment to help with that. But if you asked me to do it, I'd have to read through docs and go through things. I considered, well, which one's best, and that I get hung up a lot of times in that sort of perfectionism of like which one's best. And I know that the Drupal community has been leaning a little bit more towards DDev, so that's I think probably my focus. But I know Lando exists. I know that there are other approaches just through virtual machines that one can use, Docker versus that. So I have a few still installed on my system, but at this point, I'd probably just wipe them out, start fresh, so that way I have some sort of sense of ownership.
Okay. Well, anyone who's heard me talk knows that I recommend DDev for our students, and personally, I use DDev as well. So that's what if you're unsure, which it sounds like you're not completely unsure, but you're a little bit there's at least some uncertainty in there. I think DDev's a great place to start, and maybe you'll outgrow it, but I don't think so. I think 3 or 4 years ago there was a possibility of folks outgrowing DDev, but it's so robust and so flexible these days. I think it's pretty hard to outgrow it. I know other folks, some folks like to just write their Docker Compose files and their Docker files themselves. Honestly, if you're into that, if you're into kind of like DevOps and that type of technology, then yeah, go for it. But I think if your goal is to just have something that works, that is in my opinion best of breed. I think DDev is a great place to be, especially on a Mac. There's a lot of choices that you can make with DDev from a performance standpoint as well. How about integrated development environment? So have you used PHP Storm? I mean, the two that are used a lot in the Drupal community these days are PHP Storm or Visual Studio Code.
Yeah, I remember I made a transition from, I think it was Komodo IDE to PHP Storm when I was doing my Drupal 7 programming, and then I just listening to podcasts and just keeping tabs on what's current. VS Code being the next one. I haven't really used VS Code yet, but I have it installed just because, well, when I'm ready, I'd like to try that one out too.
All right. Well, I think that'll definitely be one of the goals for next week is to, and it might be one of those things where you don't choose. where you use PHP Storm some of the time, you use Visual Studio Code some of the time. I'm pretty confident in saying like 5, 6, 7 years ago, it seemed like there were a lot of people using things like Atom and brackets and Sublime Editor and things like that. But to me, it feels like in the past few years, the community's really coalesced around Visual Studio Code and PHP Storm. And that's not saying no one's, or everyone's only using those two. That's absolutely not true. But I think the majority of folks are using one of those two. So I think it'd be a good goal for you is just to get some time on the keyboard with both of those and see if you determine a preference. And, that could be a topic of an upcoming episode here of pros and cons, or what you like versus what you don't like, or even how to configure them and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. So based on your goals and objectives that we just talked about, and I'm going to flip back over to the objectives page. I think some kind of good objectives for the next week. If you're going to wipe out what you have, then I would get DDEV installed. You can actually go to ddev.com. There's some links there. On a Mac, there's some options as far as if you use Docker for Mac or Kalima or Rancher Desktop or Orb Stack. Those are all kind of, and I'm not sure what the proper term is, but they all serve the same function as Docker for Mac, which is kind of like the interface to the Docker kernel or Docker engine, whatever you call it.
Containerized approach versus virtualization, is that right?
Right. Okay. Yeah, I use a tool. I can't build the tool. I can tell you, I use Rancher Desktop. It's open source. It's real open source. Docker for Mac is not. I tried using Kalima for a while, but I ran into some issues with upgrading Kalima. And Orb Stack, I've heard very good things about, but that is not open source as well. So I like to try and stick with open source. So, installing DDEV with Rancher Desktop, the instructions are all on ddev.com, or I think it's actually their doc site, which is linked, obviously. But I think that's a good goal. Get DDEV installed. There's also instructions there on there's quick start instructions for installing a fresh copy of Drupal 10. Okay. So I think that's something that kind of goes right along with it. And then also, you said you have VS Code installed. I don't know if you have PHP Storm installed, but make sure those are both updated. And Drupal.org has documentation, or they might call them guide pages, for both VS Code and PHP Storm that include a list of like recommended extensions and plugins for each that are good for Drupal development.
Okay.
So I think, with our students, one of the first things we do, and I literally started our module development class yesterday. The first couple of weeks are all about just setting up your environment. It's just putting yourself in a good position to succeed, getting your tools ready. And I think that's kind of a good goal for the first week. And looking forward to week 2, we can kind of review what your setup is, and we can talk about code quality tools a little bit, things like PHP-CS and PHP Stan, and installing Drupal core's dev dependencies. And you also mentioned one of your objectives is setting up staging and production environments with CI, CD, and testing in mind. We can talk about that a little bit as well. And I think I think this is a good place to start. This is the starting point. I mean, if you're going to be a Drupal developer, you've got to have a solid environment. We can talk in the future about a remote personal development environment, something like using Gitpod, or Acquia has their cloud IDE that has, I think you can use Visual Studio Code like remotely. We can talk about that stuff. Maybe I'm old school a little bit. I really like local development environments. Although, I do have some experience with Gitpod, and that's the closest thing I've seen.
Yeah. I always like the idea of if my laptop gets damaged, are things backed up? And I know that between database file backups, if there are remotes and code pushes, that should cover most things. But it's that like getting up and running quickly. So that might be worth taking a look at. But that's the thing is I get very overwhelmed quickly when there are way too many things to pick from. And then I'm like, but where do I start? So I think this is a good.
You think the kind of the goals for this week are reasonable?
Yeah, and all the while I've been reading Adam's book, the Drupal 10 Masterclass, which has been largely skimming, and I think he admitted as much on his podcast episode that if you're familiar with it, you can kind of jump around a little bit. But just to be thorough, I've made it about halfway through the book, so I think once I get these things up and running and kind of do that, I'll just keep chipping away at reviewing that book just to kind of feel a sense of coverage. But yeah, I think that's a good plan. I'm very interested in getting to the point where I can demonstrate doing something with code. And I think my personal opinion is doing something with Contrib. So whether that's helping people with patches or something like that, because it's a direct feed to the community, but it's also a representation of myself.
I can tell you exactly what I have in mind for that. I've had something in mind since the folks at Talking Drupal approached me about doing this.
Perfect.
I think I would be doing you and the community good if one of our kind of capstone goals is I would love to see you contribute some type of automated test to a module, a Contrib module. And possibly if whatever module we select isn't already opted in to the new GitLab CI test infrastructure, that could be something else that you could kind of configure for that module because you have the interest in CI/CD. So I think we're not there yet. We're only on episode 1, but I think getting there, and it doesn't have to be a big, hairy, difficult test. It can be something simple, but getting all those pieces together, running the test locally, creating a merge request, seeing that test run on Drupal's GitLab CI infrastructure, and then getting that merge request merged in. I think that would be a nice capstone for you.
Yeah. I think that's the light at the end of the tunnel.
Wow, that was a very interesting first week. Funny, I also went to school to be a mechanical engineer. I think that's fantastic that all three of us have that commonality. I think Mike did a really great job explaining the tooling and why he uses some tools over others. And I'm really excited to hear how Chad does this week with his local environment, what tools he goes with, because there are so many out there and it can be really overwhelming at first when you're new to a local development environment. And then, just being set up for success makes that development journey so much easier. I like that all of Chad's goals and objectives were very clear, and Mike's questions to Chad are really setting up the roadmap for the series that lies ahead. So Skills Upgrade mini-series is supported by Talking Drupal and Drupal Easy. You can visit talkingdrupal.com for this episode's show notes and resources. And you can also visit drupaleasy.com and register for an upcoming intensive Drupal training course. To learn more about us, you can contact Chad Hester at chadkhester.com, or he's Chad Hester on drupal.org. And Mike Anello's contact information you can find at drupaleasy.com/contact-us. And he's Ultimike on Drupal.org. My name is Volkswagen Chick across Mastodon, LinkedIn, and D.O. And as a special promotion, the Linux Foundation is offering all of the Talking Drupal listeners a 30% off coupon for a few months. And this is 30% off e-learning, certifications, and bundles with the code all uppercase Drupal24. Thank you very much.